So I like to say that a logical fallacy is a pattern of reasoning that weakens your arguments, is an unreliable guide to the truth, and will lead you to make bad inferences. And if you're interested in studying philosophy or just getting better at arguments, then it's helpful to know the names of some common logical fallacies. And that's what we're going to do in this video. We're going to go through some of the most common logical fallacies, plus some that I see all the time but that didn't really have names before, and talk about why they're bad and why you should avoid them. One of the most common fallacies that you'll encounter is the ad hominem. This is where instead of wondering about the merits of the conclusion or the particular inferences here, you instead insult someone, and then you conclude that because of this insult or because of whatever this negative character trait is, whatever they said must be false. Importantly, just insulting someone is not an ad hominem. It's when you use the insult as the basis for drawing the conclusion that they're wrong. But people also like to appeal to authority. This is when, instead of making a direct argument for a conclusion, you appeal either to some kind of authority that has power or an authority with expertise. So if you just defer to whatever the President of the United States says, then what you're really doing is just committing the appeal to authority fallacy. But similarly, if you're just appealing to an expert and saying simply because they are an expert, whatever they say about the topic is true, that's also an appeal to authority. While in general, it's probably a good idea to listen to experts about their areas of expertise, experts are not infallible, and even the consensus of experts can be wrong. At one point, many doctors thought that cigarettes were mostly harmless. Cigarette companies actually advertised themselves as saying that they were doctor recommended. So it turns out that even medical professionals can get things wrong about health or about science. I remember being in like a philosophical debate with someone, and they told me that I was disagreeing with Plato. And look, I like Plato. I take Plato seriously, but just the fact that I was disagreeing with him was not actually evidence against my view, right? One problem with appealing to authorities is that you can often find conflicting authorities who will actually disagree with one another. And then if you think that authority figures can never be wrong, this kind of gets you into a pickle pretty quickly. Plato seems like an authority in philosophy, but there are plenty of philosophers who have disagreed with Plato. So who are we supposed to believe? Well, the answer is we should look at the quality of their arguments and their evidence and then come up with the best conclusion. An appeal to emotion is when you try to stir up feelings with whoever you're arguing with or with whoever you're trying to convince. It could even be a crowd of people. This can be both positive or negative. And depending on the emotions, we give those fallacies different names, like an appeal to fear, where we try to stir up fear in the crowd and then get them to draw whatever conclusion we'd like them to draw, or an appeal to flattery, where we try to get them to feel good about themselves so that they like us in exchange and they want to agree with us. You could imagine an appeal to hatred or an appeal to love. Basically, every kind of emotion could be the focus of an appeal to emotion fallacy. Or if you make someone feel guilty, you might be appealing to guilt or appealing to pity. So because they feel bad, in order to make themselves feel better, they want to agree with you. Many people don't like to be part of the out group. They like to be in the in crowd, and they like to hold beliefs that are relatively popular. And if you appeal to the popularity of a belief in order to justify it, that's the appeal to popularity fallacy. This is sometimes also called the bandwagon fallacy. Basically, popular beliefs can sometimes be false. In fact, I would say popular beliefs are often false. It was a very popular belief that the sun orbited around the earth, and you could imagine some future where everyone becomes flat earthers, and so that belief is incredibly popular. But just because it's popular doesn't make it true. I think there's an inverse fallacy, which very few people like to talk about, but I do think is important, and that is the appeal to heterodoxy. This is one of those fallacies that I've never seen mentioned before, but I think it's worth naming. For a certain kind of person, they like to position themselves as like a bold truth teller. They're speaking truth to power, and they sometimes take the fact that no one agrees with them as a kind of evidence for their beliefs. But again, the number of people who agree with you or disagree with you just isn't relevant to whether or not your beliefs are true. Now, we're going to get to a lot more fallacies. In fact, we're going to get to 35 fallacies in total. But before we do that, I want to talk a bit about why it's helpful to learn logical fallacies if you're trying to become a better thinker. When you're trying to learn a new skill, you want to find two different kinds of examples: positive examples and negative examples. The positive examples are going to be things that you emulate. The negative examples are going to be things that you avoid. By studying logic, you learn a lot about valid argument types, and validity is a very special logical term, which means that if the premises of an argument are true, the conclusion must be true. You want to learn what valid arguments look like and what they have in common so that you can try to make valid arguments. While you're learning about the positive examples that you want to emulate, you also want to learn about the negative examples that you want to avoid, and those are logical fallacies. And now that I'm thinking about becoming a better thinker, that reminds me of today's sponsor, Brilliant. Let's say that you want to go into software. Well, one of the core skills you're going to want to develop is learning how to think like a programmer. Look at this Python script. If you kind of ignore all of the jargon and focus on some of the bare bones bits of Python there, you'll see that it's basically logic. It's conditionals, it's conjunctions, the sorts of things that you study in logic classes. And these are essential for any kind of software development. If you want to learn to think like this, Brilliant can teach you. Just check out this course, Thinking in Code. You'll learn about loops and conditionals and a whole lot more. Let's face it, learning about programming or how LLMs work can be a bit of a slog, but Brilliant actually can make it fun. Brilliant makes it easy. They'll help you develop a daily learning habit, and each lesson is filled with hand-on problem solving that'll get you using those concepts right away, and you'll be able to move on to bigger and better projects. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Jared Henderson or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. If you think because something is old or traditional, it's more likely to be true, well, you've committed the appeal to tradition fallacy. Now, this is a really interesting case because you might have a view which says that traditional beliefs, whatever they are, they stick around because they are more likely to be true. And maybe you could make that kind of argument. But as a matter of logic, we know that some traditional beliefs end up being false. And interestingly, this is one of those fallacies that has an inverse, which I'm calling the appeal to novelty. Some people just like whatever the new belief is, and because it's the next new thing, they think it's true. Just like many old beliefs are false, many new beliefs are also false. Closely related to the appeal to novelty is the appeal to progress. The appeal to progress basically says that we should try to believe whatever is going to be believed in the future. We're just thinking ahead and thinking progressively. The problem with the appeal to progress is that people in the future can get things wrong. If you're arguing against someone and saying that they're wrong because they're a hypocrite, well, that's the appeal to hypocrisy. So imagine that I said that lying is always wrong, but you can remember a time that I lied to you. Now, that doesn't prove what I said is false. All it does is prove that I haven't lived up to my own moral ideals. Just because I've committed a moral mistake of lying to you, doesn't mean that you should commit the logical mistake of appealing to hypocrisy. Some people like to think that what is desirable must be true, but this is another fallacy. We call this the moralistic fallacy. And the inverse of that is that some people are just such pessimists that they think whatever is undesirable must be true. And I've been calling this the doomsayer fallacy. I think that's a pretty good name. Sometimes when there are two competing proposals which both seem extreme, people like to argue that somehow the truth must be in the middle. But this is either called the appeal to moderation or the middle ground fallacy. Sometimes extreme proposals are correct. Sometimes moderate proposals are correct. But just because something is extreme or just because something is moderate does not really affect whether or not it's true. It affects whether it's popular, it affects whether it's feasible, but it doesn't affect whether or not it's true. And then a super common argument that you see is an appeal to ignorance, which says that if something hasn't been disproven, then we can assume that it's true. But there are many things which haven't been disproven that we don't have any good reason to believe in. Bertrand Russell gave the example of a teapot, which is orbiting the sun. Now, we have not disproven that such a teapot existed. We don't ever go bother looking for it because it's incredibly unlikely that such a thing exists. And just because we haven't disproven it doesn't mean that it's true. Let's take a look at the genetic fallacy. This is a kind of fallacy that likes to trace beliefs back to their points of origin. If you can find that it has a good origin, you might conclude that the belief is therefore true. And if you find out that it has a bad or unsavory origin, then you find that it's actually false. But either way, the origins of beliefs have very little to do with whether or not they're true or false. If you dismiss someone's beliefs because of other people who hold those beliefs, that is a guilt by association. Many common fallacies rely on bad understandings of probabilities. The gambler's fallacy says that the past occurrences of a random event somehow affect the probability of a future event. That's a little bit imprecise, but imagine that we had a coin and we were flipping it 100 times and it landed on heads 99 times in a row. When we flip the coin the 100th time, what is the probability of it being heads? It's still just 50%. Each toss is statistically independent. A lot of probabilistic reasoning relies on taking a finite set of examples and then generalizing to a larger case. And if you don't have a big enough sample size or there's something wrong with that sample size, then you're committing a hasty generalization. If I go outside and I see that 2 dogs have white fur, and then I assume that every dog in my neighborhood must have white fur, that's a hasty generalization. The hot hands fallacy is when you assume someone who has had success in the past with a random event has a better chance of being successful in the future with those same random events. If they're truly random, past success is not a predictor of future success. So far, all of the fallacies we've talked about are informal logical fallacies. These are not strictly matters of logic, but they involve relying on bad principles of reasoning that we sort of take as axioms in our minds, and then we reason with those axioms even if we're not conscious and explicit about it. But there are also formal fallacies. These have to do with the way that logical operators in our language work. Those operators are things like if, and, or, and not. We call those Boolean operators, by the way. Take, for example, this conditional. If it's raining outside, the sidewalk is wet. If I look out my window and see that the sidewalk is wet, and then I conclude that it's raining outside, that's called affirming the consequent. We could think of other reasons why my sidewalk would be wet, right? Like someone sprayed it with their garden hose. Think about that same conditional again. If it's raining outside, my sidewalk is wet. But then I know that it's not raining outside, so I conclude that my sidewalk isn't wet. That's a bad bit of reasoning too. We call it denying the antecedent. And a good counterexample is that same neighbor spraying my sidewalk again with his hose. If you assume whatever it is that you're trying to prove, so actually the conclusion is sort of in your premises already, we call that begging the question. An equivocation is when you use the same word with 2 different meanings in your argument. Like, consider this argument. Every law requires a lawgiver. There are laws of nature, therefore there is a lawgiver of nature. Some people might find this an attractive argument for God, but the biggest problem that you face is that it's using the word law in 2 different senses. Legal laws are something that someone has to write down and state and enforce. Laws of nature are like patterns of regularity that we see in the observable universe. Those don't, by definition, require a cosmic lawgiver. When you're trying to argue against someone, it's really important that you accurately represent what they believe. And if you instead come up with a caricature of their beliefs, that's called a straw man. You are misrepresenting someone's beliefs or arguments in order to make them easier to attack. This is kind of like an equivocation, though. You're equivocating between the straw man version of their beliefs and the actual version of their beliefs. Another important fallacy is the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is a way to dismiss counterexamples which should disprove a universal generalization. Suppose that someone says that no Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge, and then a Scotsman comes and says, well, actually, I put sugar on my porridge. So then the first person replies, well, no true Scotsman puts sugar on their porridge. What should have been a counterexample to what they said before has instead become some sort of weird revision to their original definition, which just doesn't make any sense because the Scotsman is clearly a Scotsman and he's disproved what they said. An interesting fallacy whose nomenclature only really cropped up in the 21st century is the Mott and Bailey. This is when someone has 2 different positions, a radical position and a more easily defendable moderate position, and then they use those positions depending on who they're talking to. I don't like to talk about politics on this channel too much, but I think a great example of this came when people started to talk about defunding the police. So regardless of what you think of that policy, I think that we can all agree that something happened in the way we talked about that policy. At first, it was put forward as a really bold and radical position. And then when people faced criticism because it seemed too radical and maybe too extreme, they would say, oh, what I really meant was we should take a portion of police funding and channel it to mental health services. Those are just 2 different positions, and we need to be honest about which of the 2 we're actually defending. A slippery slope fallacy is when you think that a minor change is going to eventually lead to a larger and more major sort of revolution down the road. But importantly, for this to actually be a fallacy, you need to be lacking in evidence for thinking that further change will actually occur. Sometimes incremental changes do lead to larger changes, and it's right to consider those possible ramifications down the road. But what often happens is that we assume the slippery slope, then we argue against the major changes, and we act as if those are arguments against the minor changes. And that's just not a good way to argue. If you assume that because 2 events are often correlated, that one of them causes the other, then you have committed a particular kind of fallacy that we often just call correlation versus causation. Many events are correlated, so they happen a lot regularly, but that doesn't mean that either one causes the other. Two fallacies that are helpful to keep in mind concern the relationship between parts and wholes. One of those is the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy that says that a property that's had by all of the parts of something must be had by the thing that those parts make. But here's an example, and we can just talk about me. All the cells in my body are microscopic, but I'm not microscopic. The inverse of that fallacy is the fallacy of division, which says that whatever property an entire whole has, all of its parts have. And the final fallacy I want to talk about is the comparative fallacy. This is when you start with a comparative claim and then you infer an absolute claim. A Rolex is cheaper than a Patek Philippe, but that doesn't mean a Rolex is a cheap watch. It's absurdly expensive. I know that any video about logical fallacies is going to stir up some debate, and I know that I've left some fallacies off this list, so I would love to hear what you think down below. I hope you learned something, and I'll talk to you soon.